"What is that?" Terry Sherman wondered as he looked across the field, at the distant animal loping in his direction. He paused briefly and put down the heavy box he had lifted off the truck. Terry had the perfect eyesight of a trained marksman, and he knew from half a mile away that this animal was big. The approaching shape was much too big for a coyote. His wife joined him, an unspoken question in her eyes. Terry briefly nodded his head in the direction of the animal, and she too began to look puzzled. The thing was about 400 yards away, and the closer it got, the bigger it looked. "Wolf," murmured Terry's wife. Then Terry's father also joined them. The beast was gray, and even from 300 yards, they could see that its pelt was wet from running through the wet grass. The animal loped gracefully in a series of S-turns and stopped about 50 yards away from the family. This was very bizarre behavior for a wolf. But this wolf was almost 3 times as big as any Terry had ever seen. It gazed peacefully at the family. Terry's wife shifted uneasily, and glanced around to see where her 2 children were. Both were standing in silence on the top of the flatbed truck, looking right at the wolf. "Maybe it's somebody's pet," ventured Terry's father. The animal began walking casually toward the family, unconcerned, but obviously determined to make some kind of contact. It appeared completely tame. Terry glanced at the corral 70 feet to his right, where he had just unloaded several of his prize Angus calves. They were the first of his herd to be on the property, and briefly, he wondered about the wisdom of bringing them onto the land. One calf, more curious than the rest, stood with its head through the bars of the corral, looking directly at the wolf that was now only 100 feet away. The other animals were at the back of the corral, and they shifted nervously at the strong scent in the air. From 10 feet away, the smell of rain on the dog pelt filled the air as the animal trotted peacefully up to Terry's father. Like his son Terry, he stood over 6 feet tall, and the wolf reached almost to his chest. Massive muscles rippled beneath its shiny gray-silver coat. The eyes were a shocking shade of light blue that penetrated the soul. Terry's father reached down and petted the huge beast as it stood looking at the family. Terry felt a tightening in his gut. Something was not quite right. Even somebody's pet wolf would not be this completely tame. A 200-pound wolf exuding a zen-like calm? Something did not compute. The animal walked nonchalantly around in front of the family, and Terry's wife and father began to relax. Terry's wife turned around and yelled to the kids to come over. Kids jumped from the flatbed and ran over. The family began talking all at once. Terry's son suggested that they try to keep the wolf as a pet. But it was too late. They saw the swift, graceful bound that took the wolf to the bars of the corral. With unbelievable speed, the young calf's head was trapped in the animal's powerful jaws. The movement had been lightning fast, and the family stood paralyzed with fear. The 300-pound calf bleated pitifully as the wolf tried to drag it through the bars of the corral. Terry sprang into action, ran across, and landed 2 powerful kicks into the ribs of the wolf. Terry's father followed and grabbed a stout baseball bat he had just unloaded. With all of his considerable strength, he beat on the wolf's back as it braced against the bars of the corral, trying to drag the hapless calf through it. The bleats were getting more urgent as the vice-like lock on the calf's snout tightened. "Get my magnum!" Terry barked as he aimed more kicks at the wolf's ribs. Even as the sickening thud of Terry's heavy boots rained into the animal's abdomen, the beast seemed unconcerned. Terry's son ran to the flatbed, retrieved a powerful handgun, and quickly delivered it to his father. Sherman took aim and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang across the field and slammed into the wolf's ribs. The slug from the 357 had no effect whatsoever on the attacking animal. It didn't yelp, didn't pause, and didn't bleed. Quickly, Terry pumped 2 more shots into the wolf's upper abdomen. On the 3rd shot, the wolf slowly and reluctantly released the bleating calf. The calf scampered quickly to the back of the corral, and still bleating, lay down. It was bleeding heavily from the head. The huge beast stood about 10 feet away from Terry, but displayed no signs of discomfort. Terry couldn't believe it. 3 shots from a magnum should have killed the animal or at least very badly injured it. Not a sound came from the wolf as it gazed unconcernedly at Sherman. The chilling, hypnotic blue eyes looked straight at him. Sherman raised the magnum again and, aiming carefully, shot the animal near the heart. It backed off maybe 30 feet, still facing the family, and still showing no signs of distress. A chill crept over Terry. The family drew closer together. They were all more than familiar with the power of the Colt Magnum. They had seen firsthand the devastation it causes, yet this huge wolf was not even making a sound, after being shot 4 times at point-blank range. There were no signs of blood on the beast. It seemed peaceful but glanced back at the calf in the corral, as if pondering the wisdom of another attack. "Get the 30-06, Terry said through clenched teeth, never taking his eyes off the huge beast. Terry's son ran to the homestead, and returned in seconds bearing the heavy firearm. Terry had killed dozens of elk from over 200 yards with this weapon. As he took aim at the wolf a mere 40 feet away, he momentarily felt pity for the beast. The thunderous shot rang out. The sound of the bullet hitting flesh and bone near the shoulder was unmistakable. The wolf recoiled, but stood calmly looking at Terry. His mouth went dry. He felt a cold sweat running down his back. Terry's wife began to cry. Terry's father began to curse softly under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. The wolf should be a silent, bleeding pile of dead flesh. Instead, it had recoiled, backed off maybe 10 feet, but still seemed perfectly healthy. Terry took a deep breath and raised the weapon again, aiming for the huge chest cavity. The bullet ripped through the animal, and a sizable chunk of flesh detached from the exit wound and lay on the grass. Still, the wolf made no sound. Then, with a last unhurried look at the stunned family, the wolf turned slowly and began to trot away across the grass. Tears of fear streamed down Terry's face as she hugged her 12-year-old daughter. Terry's face was white, and there was a strain in his voice as he turned toward his family. "Let's keep calm," he muttered hoarsely, but didn't sound very convincing. "I'm going after it." The animal was now almost 100 yards away, trotting west across the field in the direction of a dense group of cottonwoods. Beyond the cottonwoods lay a roaring creek. Terry's son grabbed the magnum, and Terry hefted the 30-aught, and the family watched as they sprinted off in the same direction as the wolf. The animal was only trotting but was covering ground quickly. Anger and fear pulsed through Terry as he pushed himself to run quicker. He was already out of breath, but they were gaining on the wolf. They could see the animal disappearing into the belt of cottonwoods, and then reappear in the open ground beyond. It stopped, momentarily shaking itself free of the moisture from the grass, before heading for the creek. Terry's son ran silently, feeling how upset his father was, but concentrating on keeping the wolf in his sight. The wolf seemed to be accelerating. It was now almost 300 yards ahead of them, and still loping easily as it reached a denser patch of Russian olive trees that bordered the creek. As they ran, Terry noticed that the tracks of the animal were easily visible in the wet ground. Terry was an experienced tracker, and he was confident that they could track the animal, even in the thick Russian olives. His sharp eye spotted the silver-gray blur as the animal disappeared into the tree line. Minutes later, Terry and his son ran into the line of trees, following the giant animal's tracks. In some places, it had left inch-deep impressions in the soft ground. There was no evidence of blood on or between the huge footprints. Terry couldn't shake the fear he felt as he brushed through the tightly woven undergrowth. His pace had slowed because the large trees were interwoven with thorny brambles and weeds. The tracks were still visible. As they approached the creek, they could hear the water gurgling as it cascaded merrily over the rocks. They broke cover near the bank of the creek, and Terry held up his hand. His son stopped, and the two listened carefully. They heard no sound of an animal crashing through the undergrowth. The huge paw marks periodically meandered in and out of the surrounding vegetation, but consistently shadowed the direction of the creek. Terry guessed they had run about a mile. Several minutes later, the two broke through into the open about 40 yards from the river. They breathed a sigh of relief. It was hard going, stumbling through the trees, making sure the head-high thorns and bushes didn't take a toll on their skin and their faces. Suddenly, Terry stopped breathing. He grabbed his son's arm and pointed. The wolf tracks were directly in front of them, as plain as day, as they headed toward the creek. About 25 yards from the river, the prints entered a muddy patch, and it appeared as if the 200-pound animal had sunk almost 2 inches into the mud. The deep paw prints continued for another 5 yards, and then stopped. The track simply vanished. So did the wolf, gone. There was no possibility that the animal had leaped the intervening 60 feet to land in the river. The tracks just stopped abruptly. The Shermans walked slowly and carefully, looking at the perfectly formed tracks in the thick mud, and trying to see any change that might explain the sudden disappearance. Around where the tracks halted, the ground appeared about as soft as the mud patch. It was as if the animal had vanished into thin air. Terry looked at his son, and he could see that the teenager was white-faced and trembling, close to tears. Terry felt stunned. He couldn't reassure his son, because he just didn't have an explanation. "We'd best be getting back," he said hoarsely. "It's near sundown." Terry's son nodded dumbly, fighting to keep his father from seeing how scared he was. They were silent as they trudged the miles back to the homestead. Thoughts raced through Terry's head. The family had just moved from New Mexico to get away from the busybodies and the closed community that kept prying into their lives. They had looked in Utah because property prices were right. In this out-of-the-way place, tucked away in northeast Utah, they had found their dream property, a 480-acre homestead that had been empty for almost 7 years. The elderly previous owners had virtually abandoned it. The owners were a prosperous family, who now resided in Salt Lake City, and they visited their property a couple of times a year to make sure the fence lines were intact. They were willing to unload the property to the Shermans at a very fair price. The family knew that about a year of hard work would be required to fix it up. High ridges bound the acreage to the north, the flowing creek to the south, and extensive fencing to the west. The homestead was hidden about a mile from the nearest road, down a dirt track that was almost concealed. In short, it was a perfect refuge for a family that yearned for privacy, and a home where they could relax and put down roots. the Shermans were happy to trade a small-town life in New Mexico for a new start in a Mormon community in rural Utah. Like most of their new neighbors, the Shermans were members of the LDS Church, although they could not be considered devout. As they trudged through the deep undergrowth, Terry couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. Had they made a mistake in buying this place? Thoughts tumbled through his mind, causing his gut to tighten even more. He knew something had happened today that everyone knew was physically impossible, and it had occurred in daylight and in full view. Quickly, Terry came to a decision as he stood facing his family. He was not going to second-guess their decision to move from New Mexico. "Look, son," he said to his son. "I can't explain what happened, and I am not even going to try. Let's just forget that this ever happened, and have a meal in town." Terry's son just grinned weakly, relieved at least that his father was taking charge.